It's so good to be able to talk to you this morning. I'm feeling a bit nervous, actually. I don't know why I should be because of my friends all here. But let's have a word of prayer before we start today. Dear Lord, thank you for being such a wonderful Saviour. We need to walk with you every day. We see around about us the things that are happening in the world, and we see that your soon return is nigh. Be with us as we study part of your word today, as we look through some of the things that have happened in the past and what is likely to happen into the future. I pray, dear Lord, that you'll bless us and be with us today, for we ask it in your precious name. Amen. Once upon a time, that's the way all good fairy stories start, isn't it? Once upon a time. But I can assure you this is not a fairy story that I'm about to talk to you now. There once was a man whose name was Daniel. Who's heard of him? Certainly no fairy tale. When we think a little about him as we look in chapter 1 here of Daniel, it tells about how he was brought in from another country, from Israel. He was a Jew, he was a Hebrew boy, and he was captured by Nebuchadnezzar and brought there. And here he was in Babylon. You know, he probably had a good reason to begrudge this country that had taken him away from where he lived. Him and quite a few other young men. You see, Nebuchadnezzar had made a choice and he chose nothing but the best. Only the best, the best looking, the most intelligent young people. These are the ones he chose to bring to Babylon. And he had a reason for it, because he was a mighty king and he was a conqueror, but he wanted Babylon to be the best place it could be. And so as we look in chapter 1, we see that Nebuchadnezzar made a bit of a statement, and he said, bring all the best young men, the Hebrews, or from other countries you might have got people, only the best, bring them forward, and I want them to spend some time eating and drinking the things. We know the story, don't we? And of course, Daniel, this is the man that God chose. What a wonderful man Daniel was. But his attitude was so different. As a young man, he wasn't worried about that he was taken away from his country. He wasn't worried about that. No, he wanted to do what was right. He believed what Jeremiah said, that when you go into a captive country, you try to do what you can. You don't try to be a nuisance there. And so, of course, the king, he asked that these men, he asked the overseer to make sure that these men ate nothing but the best food. And, of course, we know the story, how Daniel went to the overseer and said, look, I'm not going to eat that food. I don't want to eat that food. I want to eat vegetables, things that I've been brought. I don't want to drink wine. I don't want to do those things. And of course, the overseer, of course, was a bit upset and said, because King Nebuchadnezzar was not anyone to be trifled with. When he said to do something, he meant do it. And so he said, but hang on, just give me 10 days trial. And if we're not any different, if we haven't improved, and of course, you know what happened. Of course, he was improved. He was improved. And so they were brought into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar. And so they were given good jobs there, given high places so that they could go on. You know, when we think about Daniel, if we just look at this, if we read, I want to encourage you to pick up your Bible and read Daniel. Read it yourself at home. Read it thoroughly. Today, I'm going to do a bit of a summary as I go through. You know, if we look at Matthew, the 24th chapter, we can't get a Becker recommendation. And Matthew, the 24th chapter, and verse 15, it says, therefore, when you see the abomination and desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. Jesus recommended Daniel, when you read Daniel and see these things. So he can't get a higher recommendation. So here he was. The first, as we look at chapter 1, we see what has happened. We see how he started to establish himself. And then as we look into chapter 2, God gave Daniel certain gifts, did he not? Gave him certain gifts. He gave him the gift of being able to interpret dreams. Well, Daniel never took that. He always said, and remember in this particular chapter, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, didn't he? He had a dream. And he was a funny sort of a king, that. He actually was quite unreasonable about it, wasn't he? He said, he brought all these wise men in and he said, I've had a dream. I want you to tell me what that dream was, and then I want you to interpret what the meaning is. Quite unreasonable, really, when you think about it. And of course, no one could. And in those days, if you couldn't do what the king said, especially someone like Nebuchadnezzar, he said, well, I'm going to tear you all to pieces if you can't. If you can't tell me that, enter Daniel. Daniel was probably a bit worried whether he was going to be killed too, right, maybe. And so he came to Nebuchadnezzar. And the thing about Daniel was, he said, I can interpret the dream, but it's not me that's interpreting it. It's the great God of heaven. This is one of the first occasions that Daniel has pronounced God as being the overruling power to this mighty king who was so full of himself. Anyway, we know he told the story. He did the interpretation of this. We all know the dream was a giant statue and with a head of gold and a chest of silver and thighs of bronze and, of course, the great legs of iron and then the feet, a mixture of clay and iron. And Daniel just told him, well, what's going to happen. You are the head of gold. And I suppose I could see him. He was thinking he was something really great. Yes, of course I'm the head of gold. But then there's going to become some other. It's going to be another civilization is going to take over, and it's going to be that's going to represent the silver. And then after that, another one representing the bronze. And then after that, a mighty one. But Nebuchadnezzar never really thought about that. And Daniel did his job. He did what he was supposed to do. He emphasised that God was the mighty king. And as we look at chapter 3, we see that Nebuchadnezzar really didn't pay too much attention to that. He didn't pay that too much attention to that. He was worried about that dream in a way. He was worried about only the head being of gold. Wasn't he the mighty conqueror of the world? Didn't he have plans to extend his municipality? Wasn't he going to get bigger and bigger and bigger? He wasn't going to get any weaker. No, he was going to get stronger. There's going to be no other civilization come in and take it over. So what did he do? He built a great big statue, about 100 feet high. It was all pure gold. It probably had a bit of resemblance of him in the face too, I'd say. And he put it on the plain of Dura, and he got everyone to come, had a big party. And Daniel's not in this chapter. He's just missing in this. I don't know whether he was on holidays or what, but he's not mentioned here at all. Just his two friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And we know what happened. We know how the king said, when the music plays, everyone's to bow down. And of course, there were some people, I guess, in that time that didn't like these Hebrews being elevated to high positions. And it didn't take long. When everyone was told to bow down, of course, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they didn't care. They followed the true God. They weren't going to bow down at all. And of course, we know what happened. These people said, there's some men over here. And of course, the king got very upset. And we know the story of the fiery furnace, how these three young men were thrown in. Yes. And how again, God was shown to be a great God, because when the king looked in, there wasn't 3 men in there was 4. And we know how he realised then, again, God had shown this full of himself king that he wasn't the power, that God, this great God of Israel, and these 3 young men showed that too. It was just an amazing thing, really. And then if we look in chapter 4, This is a strange chapter, this. And when you read the first 5 verses of chapter 4, it's almost as if, well, you'd think Daniel's writing Daniel, but this is almost just like it's been written by the king himself. If you look there, it says, in chapter 4, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king to all peoples and nations. It's him talking, languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace will be multiplied. And in this dream, or in this, as he was talking, he sort of made a confession about the way God was going to deal with him. He didn't understand. He had a dream again, a dream about a tree. And we won't go completely into that, but what it meant was that God was going to teach him a lesson. And he didn't understand. Again, he brought in the kings, the Chaldeans, the sorcerers, the wise men. He told them the dream, but they couldn't interpret it. Now, enter Daniel again. In comes Daniel. And I suppose he would have been a little bit nervous about interpreting this dream. How would you like to go if you were a wise man or a so-called wise man to go before a king like Nebuchadnezzar and say, what's going to happen to you is you're going to go out into the fields and eat grass. You're going to be like an animal. You're going to have a heart of an animal. For 7 years you're going to do that. And that's just what happened. You know, the king went out there for 7 whole years before he was finally restored again. God had put upon him the reason that he was the one to follow. Don't worry about yourself. Don't worry that you are the great ruler of Babylon, because that never left his head. That pride was always in his head, that he didn't need the God, really. He didn't need him. He was going to be more powerful. He wasn't going to be replaced. And then we go on to chapter 5. Now, chapter 5, you know, there's something I'd like to tell you about chapter 5. You know, we read chapter 5, and, you know, down through the centuries, people have read chapter 5. And they've said, now, there was no such person as Belshazzar. What's Daniel going on about here? Belshazzar was never a king in Babylon. There was Nebuchadnezzar, but there was never Belshazzar. His name wasn't shown anywhere in history. And for quite a long time, people thought that. They thought that the story in chapter 5 was just a figment of Daniel's imagination. That's what they thought. They thought that, you know, it must have been, he must need to just tell a funny story, and so he just made it up. That's what they thought. That's what people thought about chapter 5. And of course, as we know about that, cylinders and tablets of the Babylonian Empire in the last 100 years have been dug up, and lo, what do you see? You see Belshazzar's name very much in evidence. Yes, you know how they said there was no such thing. People that didn't believe this wonderful book said, this is not a true book. There's no such thing. They talk about the Hittites in this book, and there's no such, we can't see any sign of the Hittites. And so they said the Bibles are false. The Bible tells lies. But sure enough, as archaeology went on, we found the names of the Hittites take their place in history. And here, this wonderful book is brought back again, the bestseller in the world for no reason other than it's so much truth. And so it was that Belshazzar, his name came in. We should not be duly concerned about verse 2, because in verse 2 it says that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he certainly wasn't the son. It was the thing in those days, in that culture, to use the word son as an equivalent to the descendant, to a descendant. Actually, he was the son of Nabonidus, who was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So when we see that, you know, thus we have Jesus of Nazareth described as the son of David. This is a well-known ploy of that time and acknowledged freely by every historian and scholar who has any affinity to that period of history. So this, you know, we know that this is a true story. And as we look at this story of Belshazzar, he probably wasn't such a great person. He probably did a lot of things. We're not told all that. All we're told really here is that he insulted God. He threw a party. And he decided in all his wisdom that he would take the precious goblets and the precious utensils and the things that they took, that Nebuchadnezzar years and years before had taken from the Jerusalem out of the temple, and he was going to put alcohol in them and toast his gods and have a really good party time. And he was in the middle of that, wasn't he? When all of a sudden he saw the cryptic hand writing on the wall. God wasn't going to take that. He saw the hand writing this cryptic language on the wall. Of course, in comes the soothsayers and the astrologers and bring in all the wise men once again. Here we go. But they couldn't understand it either. No, they couldn't understand it. And then enter the queen. The queen says, wasn't there, remember Daniel when he came in and gave the interpretation to King Nebuchadnezzar? Remember that? Remember him? And then all of a sudden entered Daniel again. And here he is brought in to give this interpretation to this king. And the king offered him, said he'd put the royal coat on him and give him so much he wouldn't know what to do with it. He was already a rich man. Daniel wasn't interested in that. He just said, I will give you the interpretation. And that he did. And that interpretation wasn't a good one for King Belshazzar. Actually, the interpretation was actually telling this is the end of this empire of Babylon. Because that very night, that empire finished. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. That's what was written. You will. And that very night, the Medes and the Persians, they emptied the river that ran through the city, and then they marched their armies in. Everyone was drunk and celebrating and having a great party in Babylon. And Belshazzar died that night. And a new empire took over in chapter 5. Now as we move on to chapter 6, this is just a very nice story, isn't it? A lovely story about what God can do for someone, what he can do for us. You know, Daniel, like I said, there was a lot of jealousy in Babylon. These Hebrew people, at this particular time of verse 6, Daniel was the prime minister. He had a very, very high position. He was very wealthy and he knew everything. And Darius, who was the new king, not Nebuchadnezzar now, Darius, the king of the Medes, he respected Daniel and kept him in that high position, for he knew that he was a competent and a wonderful man, and things went well under Daniel's regime. So he had a high position there, and you know, but there was some jealousy around there. There must have been, because, you know, just as there were when the three Hebrews didn't bow down to someone told them. Some people just concocted a plan, not liking to have Daniel in such a high position, and went to the king, oh, look, why don't we have a 30-day period where you don't pray to anyone, you don't pray to any gods, that you don't pray at all? Because he said, why don't you do that? And if anyone does that, and they're sort of putting his mind up, making him big, sort of a big shot, you just put your seal there. And if anyone does it, they'll be thrown into the lion's den. And of course, Daniel wasn't going to stop praying. He prayed every night. He opened his windows. He decided to keep on praying that way, and he did so. And of course, all of a sudden the king realised in a way that he'd been trapped, really. He'd put his seal, and when a king put his seal on something, it had to go forward. And even though he liked Daniel, he had to say, okay. So Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. The king couldn't sleep that night, and he rushed early in the morning and called out his name. And we know the story how Daniel said, I'm here, king. The angel has closed the lion's mouth. And of course, those that had played that trick on the king, they suffered the indignity of being thrown, them and their families, in with the lions. And it says the lions had eaten them up before they even hit the ground. That's just a story in chapter 6. And I'll just summarise these chapters as we go along. And then we move into another chapter, chapter 7. And here's where the book of Daniel changes completely. These first 6 chapters have been very historical chapters. It's told us about what happened. It tells us wonderful stories about Daniel in the lion's den, 3 Hebrews in the fiery furnace, the king losing his mind and being put out for 7 years, eating grass, and the spine-tingling story of Belshazzar's feast. All factual and historical events that we can read in this book. And you know, as we move into chapter 7, we see this is the prophetical part of Daniel. Daniel has some dreams which point us to the future, which showed him the future in advance. He was living in the time of the Medes and the Persians. He was getting on in age. He was probably around 75 years old. He hadn't really got a chance to go back with the Hebrews. I think even when the Hebrews, his people, went back to Jerusalem, he still didn't go. Maybe he was just too old. Maybe, we don't know, but he was still here. But in chapter 7, you know, we read these actual stories, and he had a vision. And the vision harks back in a way to chapter 2 where the king saw the statue, and Daniel explained to them what it meant. This kingdom will come, then this kingdom, then this kingdom. In chapter 7, we're told he sees in more detail what is going to happen. He sees and dreams about these 4 beasts that come out of the sea. The first beast is like a lion, and it had wings, it says, and tells in more detail about Babylon. Then it was followed by a beast that was like a bear that had three ribs in its mouth. And of course that was Medo Persia. And then a beast like a leopard, which was Greece. And then of course the most dreadful and terrible beast, that one that was to wreak havoc wherever it went. You know, these wonderful prophecies, the things that we see here point to the future. It was pointing to Daniel to a little bit into the future, showing him what had already happened and then what was about to happen. And he was going to see this thing happen. But, you know, as he looked forward, as he looked into these things, he started to get a little bit tired. He started to get a bit down on himself, I guess. He was an old man. And as we move into chapter 8, this here again is another prophetic chapter. Now, in this particular chapter, in great detail, we see how he had another dream in chapter 8. Now, the thing about these 2 dreams, in chapter 7 and chapter 8, you know, these chapters, like chapter 6, 7, 8, they're not exactly in chronological order. Yes. You see, when he had these dreams in chapter 7 about the beasts coming out, that was actually in the time of Belshazzar, back in chapter 5. Yes, he actually had these dreams back there, before Belshazzar was killed and before it ended. He had these visions of 7 and 8 back there. And as we looked at 7, as we move into 8 and just summarise what he saw in 8. Let's just turn to 8 and look. And what's it said? It says, as I just said, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. That's in 7. I saw in the vision, and so it happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan and the citadel, which is the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river. He was standing by the river. Then I lifted up my eyes, and I saw there, standing beside the river, a ram which had 2 horns. Right. A ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up first. And I saw the ram rushing westward, northward, southward, so that no beast could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will. And of course he was talking about Medo-Persia. His time, he'd seen it happen. Medo-Persia became very great. It had 2 horns. One horn was bigger than the other, which indicated the 2, Medo-Persia, the 2 countries that were involved there. And this ram was ferocious, and it wiped out all before them. But then it goes on, it became great, it said in verse 4. But then in verse 5, he says, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which had been standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram, and he was moving with rage against him, attacking the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him. This goat was a very, very powerful nation, and that had one big notable horn. That big notable horn was the general that led them, Alexander the Great. We've all heard of Alexander the Great. And it was moving swiftly. And that's just what Greece did. It didn't take long to annihilate everyone before him under the great leadership of Alexander the Great. And so this ram, it came in and annihilated Medo-Persia and then took over. And you see, as we read a little bit further on, you attack the ram, and it says, but therefore the male group grew very great. Medo-Persia was great, but Greece grew very great. It became strong. The large horn was broken. Wow, the large horn was broken. You know what that means? It meant the death of Alexander. When that big horn was broken, Alexander was killed. He's only 32 years of age, a very young man. But he drank, and I think he must have wrecked his kidneys and wrecked everything that drink wrecks. Because at the age of 32 years old, he died. And he lost his power, and the other 4 horns that were left after the big one was broken was the 4 generals, which he knew were weak, but still he put them all in charge, knowing that they'd sort themselves out, that the stronger one would come forward. And as Daniel was looking at these things, he became a bit sick. And then as he looked on further and saw what the little horn power was going to do, as he looked on further and saw how that through the ages, this little horn power was going to really get onto God's people, really persecute them right through to the very end of time. He saw this, and he fainted. He fainted. He couldn't take it in. He couldn't take it fully in. And the thing about it is, and we'll look at it in chapter 12, how God solved this problem. But really, and we will just take a look there in verse 12. Look at verse 12. We're skipping a little bit, but time doesn't allow me to spend an awful lot of time on these things. These are sermons in themselves. Verse 12, and chapter 12 and verse 4. Where are we? Right. But you, Daniel, it said, Gabriel came before him. Gabriel was sent to him because he was in such a state. He had fainted. It was really worrying him, the things that he had seen that was going to happen. You know, by the way, when you're reading Daniel, look in Daniel 9. I haven't covered Daniel 9 today, but read through Daniel 9 because you'll see the most beautiful prayer that Daniel says for his people. It's the most wonderful prayer. It's worth just getting out and looking at Daniel 9 as he prayed for his people that he loved so much. But it says here in verse 4, in chapter 12, that you, Daniel, shall shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. So God, in other words, said, close up the book, Daniel. It's not for your time. And then later on in that chapter, near the end, it says there, and one said to the man, clothed in linen, who was above the waters, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? And then down here, but you go your way, he says to Daniel, for you shall rest and will arise to your inheritance in the end of the days. So Daniel didn't have to worry about that. The book was closed. And when God says that something is closed, it is closed. And for many centuries, people looked at the book of Daniel. People saw just read the first part of Daniel, where the stories and the history is. And that's all. But the other chapters of prophecy were just a conundrum to them. They didn't understand it. They didn't read it. And God said the book will be closed, but there will be a time, because this is a message for the end days. And that's exactly what happened. You know, as we look at Daniel, and there's a story of the 2,300 days, and wow, you could do 5 sermons on that one. And you could, if you look at it, but what I'm trying to preach today is about how we're looking forward to the end of time. And in the 2,300 days, if you look at it, you see all the times that have come into place, how Daniel saw these things, and he saw how, you know, God's people were going to be brought back. He saw on further until Jesus came. And that 7-year period where Jesus was born, and then 31 years later, he went onto the cross. And then we see the added time there where the 1,800 odd years, the 1,810 years that passed through to a certain date, the end of the 2,300 days, 1844. And when we look to that, we sort of realise that what God is saying, that what this prophecy is telling us, that the last days on earth were probably going to start in 1844. Now we know the real reason what happened, because it said to Daniel, after 2,300 days, the sanctuary will be cleansed. That's what happened in 1844. We do know that there was a great disappointment in 1844 when people actually thought that Jesus was coming in 1844. But it wasn't that. It was, we know that Jesus was entering the most holy place, that the judgment was about to start. And really this indicates the end of time. 1844, we're now living in what's the date? I've forgotten. What date are we living in? 2016. So as we look at this, you know, let's just look at 1844 and the time after 1844, because God said the book will be closed. Now, I don't wish to take anything away from the ministry of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary, but we've just got to talk a little bit. We all know that that's what happened. We all know about the great disappointment. We have said the end of the 2,300-year period ushered in the beginning of end time. Some have used the expression the time of the end, and that's appropriate. Think of what happened in our world since 1844. The Industrial Revolution began to pick up at the speed of amazing right. Just think, God said the book will be closed, but at a certain time, at the appropriate time, knowledge will be increased. How much has knowledge been increased since, say, 1844? The more new inventions that surged through the patent offices of the world, the faster the newfangled ideas of yesterday became the old-fashioned relics of today and the laughable museum pieces of tomorrow. Changes in locomotion, you know, how things have changed. You know, the combustion engine brought forward a new batch of cars into the world. It puts 2 or 3 cars sometimes in people's garage today. We're tearing around. We move at a hectic pace. The Wright brothers would turn in their grave or stand in astonishment if they saw what they do in aviation today, if they saw the way that planes shoot across the sky, if they saw you can quickly jump on a plane and before you know it, well, not before you know it, but you're in England. You know, you travel at very fast, moving at supersonic speeds everywhere. Technology has just gone haywire. You know, phones. Alexander Bell, he made the first phone back in the 1840s. Yeah, how far the phone has gone. Wow. You know, you see people walking down the street staring at this little thing. They bump into you if you're not careful. You've got to sidestep them because they don't see you coming. They're too interested in what they're seeing here. Just this little thing that sits in your pocket. When they made the first computer, I think it took up a whole building, didn't it? A whole building. And yet, this little thing you carry in your hand today is so much more efficient. It just would leave it in the shade. You wouldn't even look at it. It was nothing. Technology has gone ahead. It's just moving further and further again. You know, there was a fellow back in 1840, he thought that, you know, back in the 1840s that, you know, in the 1840s, I think it was about 1840, that, you know, nothing else could ever be, you know, invented. We'd come to the end of it in 1840s. In fact, he threw in his job as an inventor. He threw it in and found himself another job and got in early because he wanted to get in quick and get another job before the others woke up to the fact that nothing else can be invented. This is back in 1840s. Wow, how things have changed. How things have changed. Consider the rate of development that is obvious in the century or so since the wonders were hailed as evidence of man's inventive genius. There's a story, and I've just told you about that story. Then there is this statement in Daniel 12:4, recognising that God had indeed revealed something extraordinary to Daniel. It was even too much for him. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And this was fulfilled to the letter, ladies, brethren. Fulfilled to the letter. But it was not merely the new inventions that caused people to wonder what marvel might come next. Just before this, in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, earnest students of the Word of God began to study the Bible. Yes, the Bible, this was closed up. But at the time of the end, it was going to be opened. People were going to start studying about this. The prophecies of Daniel were not studied much before this time. It was as if God had placed his hand over the sacred writings. Yes, he had. The message had been sealed and the book shut. Its message a mystery. Those who had ventured into the book of Daniel had to content themselves with the years judged through the 19th century. Bible students began to unravel the wonders of the book. Daniel's secrets were unlocked. No longer were the prophecies masked over. The knowledge of the Word of God was enhanced more and more to the understanding of the message. So there's no need for us to worry about it. It's not a conundrum to us now. We know through various ages and studies, and we know through Sister White, that has been revealed to us, and we know what is going to happen in these last days of history. Today we no longer see deep shadows obscuring the message of Daniel's prophecies. No, we don't see it. And why? Because God has said the message was for the time of the end. This message was for the time of the end. And the time of the end is upon us. Brothers and sisters, it is now. We're living in this time. We can't go on much longer. You know, we don't know when God Jesus is going to come. As Jesus said, only the Father knows that. And he'll come as a thief in the night. But we know it's very soon by what we see. The time of the end is upon us, and it's now. Knowledge of God's most significant prophecies have been increased marvellously. And all those prophecies will soon be fulfilled. So as we look at Daniel, as we see the first few chapters, as we see as he goes into the prophecy and it leads through and shows us through, we can see and we can travel and we can check it out and see which stage of the journey went on and on and on until we come to the final last days when knowledge will be increased. And all these prophecies will soon be fulfilled. Then the earth, like the sanctuary in heaven, will also be cleansed of evil. Even so, come Lord Jesus.